So like I said, she did it wrong. She removed her hand. The stick has to continuously pass. So your hands should not cross each other's hands. Yes, only in the finger you have to nudge and push the stick. Okay, no more instructions. I think no more instructions with Anna. Kavya is going to keep a timer for 2 minutes. In 2 minutes, yes, round agutho ashtu. And if something drops, please pause the timer. Okay? So keep the count individually. How many number of times you are passing the stick. So this group is using this. You have to use only the first two part, like this part of the hand. Do it faster, Yeah. So this group did it. No, you're doing this. Your fingers are like this. Which group? Which group? No, your finger position is only like this. That is nobody's problem. So which group? 3. One sit up, please. Everybody, come on. That's what I said. You figure out however you want to stand, and then I'll pass the stick. What's the time left? Anjana, what's the time left? 1 minute left. Sir is using this knuckle. Which group is this? 4. Group 4. One squat, please. One sit up. One sit up. Very nice. Yes. Thank you. Yes. I'll also do with you. 1. Okay, we'll start with 1. So madam is also using which group, ma'am? No, see, I can see here. No, here. See, No. I told very clear. Which group? Group 2. Okay, one squat. 1. Okay. So ma'am, I said you cannot move. Which group is this? 2. Group 2. One more squat. Please squat. Okay, wise. Okay. You cannot move. Okay. Just for the fun, just try and do faster.
Group 3 ready.
Fingers should be like this, sir, not like this. Which group? Group 1. Okay, very close to you. Okay. 1, 2, 1. Okay. So no, you cannot take it here. You should be only in this two. Which group? No, sir. He has explanation for everything. Which group?
3.
Okay, group 3. 1, 2, 3, go! Oh, they're all sitting on the chair. Okay.
The maximum punishment you only are taking.
Yeah.
Every one of us.
Sir is changing the place, sir.
Yeah, you should not move, please. You should not move. Sir, thumb use ಮಾಡಬಾರದು. Only this tip. Okay, this group again. Which group is this?
4.
Group 4. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Let's go. Do it. Okay. All right. Okay. We are going to do this for long year. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you so much. So, I'll also tell you what is the underlying principles, please. Now you can go back to your preferred seats. Oh my god, you all are like jumping onto your older principles. Okay, alright. So, why did we do this game basically? Any guesses, any idea why we did this game? Concentration. Communication. Yes. So there was a lot of instruction that went in, but as you can see that still people were finding it sometimes. So why we did this game was to demonstrate the delicate balance that we may need to maintain as a in the ecosystem, or this is how we do the balancing act. We are putting ourselves certain limitations. Ingrid code pass madre, it becomes very easy. Again, if you had done it in your own group, you would have passed. If I said, okay, group 1, you pass, you're only your group members, you would have tried to do more rounds. Now you are more careful, you don't want to pass it on to others and other things, right? So this is how we try and understand. We are passing this from probably one generation to another. Things that need to be kept in balance, needs to be handled with care. And yes, one more important takeaway was, like the gentleman pointed out, is punishment. If your group member did something wrong, the whole group gets punished. Old, young, sick, children, they're not spared, right? So the punishment is in the sense when you draw it back to your climate, you see actions or lack of actions can have consequences on groups that are not most likely, sometimes are not in the focus. Okay, so we are trying to bring this facilitation aspect here because this is not a space where we are trying to build knowledge for you. You come with variable levels of knowledge, and like how Rajeshwari will point out, our portal will be uploaded with a lot of content, resource materials for you to go back and plan your training, subsequent trainings and everything. This is just for us to come, reflect, think, chintana, mantana, everything that we do here, take back some points home, and like the speaker earlier mentioned, we'll have to reflect on our actions, and then towards tomorrow you'll also realize that we are driving back an action plan home. So you will take an action plan with yourselves how out of this program, and with that, I'm so sorry to have kept the guest waiting for a long time, and amongst us. She is the sector head at Climate, Environment and Sustainability. She holds a PhD in Ecology and Environmental Sciences from Pondicherry University, MSc in Botany from MS University, Baroda, BSc in Botany from Ethiraj College for Women, Chennai. She is part of a number of professional bodies, administrative and executive posts, such as being consultant scientist at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. She worked as an expert with the UNFCCC roster of experts for India. Right now. So her areas of interest include climate change vulnerability, land-based mitigation and adaptation. So she's also part of she's an associate editor for Frontiers in Forests and Global Change, International Journal for Climate Action, Strategies and Management, and academic editor on PLOS one editorial board. We're very privileged to have you here, ma'am, and I'm sure you're going to enlighten us with some of the things. So some of us are here seeking a couple of stats as well as a couple of questions that we want to take back home. So I'm sure you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon. Very happy to be here. In fact, I think I enjoyed seeing the teachers being students for a change. Punishment and other things, and you took it in the right spirit. I think the most important thing out here is that which this entire program is trying to focus on is all of us know a lot of things in our own fields. But then what is very important is to connect the dots, right? So, and when we talk about climate change as an issue, connecting the dots is the crux of it. Because everything that we do, we don't do, has implications for all other things. So, which is why, we are talking about climate change as an issue, and we are a small player in this entire climate system, but we've had a lot of impact on the system. And being the culprits, we also should know, and being, the humankind who is doing a lot of innovation, lot of advancements in technology and a whole lot of things, we need to find solutions also. It's again a selfish motive. It's for ourselves, our children, grandchildren, the next generations to come, and so on and so forth. Now, when we try to do that, it's not only about the space that we live, it's about the water that we drink, the air that we breathe, the food that we eat, and a whole lot of other things. So this important fine thread of connection that is there is extremely important. So which is what I will try to kind of bring in during the next 1 hour or so. Depending on the interaction, it might spill over, but then that's exactly what I would try to do. Although the focus is going to be on primarily water agriculture, some details about it, because without the food that we eat and its impacts, obviously, we don't have a life to go on as we move forward. So the way I kind of structure this entire talk is, one, I'm going to get into some basics. I'm sure you heard about it, but just to kind of, let's say, a revision, which teachers definitely believe in, and as parents also we believe in a lot of revision. So let's look at the basics, and then I'll stop for a few minutes to have some interaction around it. Then I'll get into talking about larger impacts of climate change, and then again I'll stop and we will want to hear about your experience, what you have seen in your own lifetime. Have you perceived any change? Can you relate to what is being talked about? Or even if it is not your own experience, maybe elders in your family. Or if you come from if you come from a rural setup and you are from a farming household, you obviously can relate a lot to some of the changes that I'm going to be talking about. So let's talk about shared experiences. And then of course I'll get into the specific topic of climate change, water, agriculture. And I'll stop for any Q&A that we might have, some questions, some clarifications, something that you think is different from what I'm talking about. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with what are your key takeaways from this session? What is it that you're taking, the big picture that goes out from this room, wherever you're going to be taking it. So coming to the basics, greenhouse gas effect. Now this is basic school science that all of us have studied and all of us have taught, either as a teacher or as a parent or as somebody's aunt, sister, whatever that is, or brother. Let me keep the gender in place out here, because in climate change, gender is another issue, which I might not be able to talk about, but then that's a very strong point when we talk about climate change, its impact, gender equity. Right? How different people are impacted, how does it impact men versus women, and a whole lot of things, which we will not be able to get into, but just flagging it here. Now, when we talk about the greenhouse gas effect, one thing that I always hear, especially when I'm talking to students, is that they say, but this is an important phenomenon, because what we study is that without this greenhouse effect, the Earth's temperature would not be able to support life at all. It maintains a certain temperature which allows life to exist on the Earth's surface. So now why are we even considering this as a problem? So what really happened, what changed this understanding, what made it an issue is because in the last century, we human, because of multiple activities that we've done in the name of development, right, such as burning fossil fuels, deforestation, cutting down large areas of forests, have all increased the concentration of greenhouse gases, which forms a layer on the Earth's surface. Now, what is this greenhouse effect? When sunlight hits the surface of the Earth, it's absorbed, but some of it is reflected back, right? And only some of it retained inside, and it gets converted into heat. But then what's happening because of this increased concentration of gases on the Earth's surface is that more and more of light is getting trapped inside the Earth's surface. So obviously more heat. That's what global warming is all about, right? So it's acting like a glass house, a greenhouse. So some heat, although it continues into space, while rest gets trapped, what we see is more and more of it getting trapped, and which is why this is a cause of concern. Now, on the one hand, I'm talking about increased gas. I'm also talking about temperature. How are these two connected? Does science have an answer for it? Then yes, the question is, yes, it does have an answer. So just look at this particular graph out here, which is, look at the time scale. It's 800,000 years of data that's gone in here. Where Antarctic temperature is plotted, you also have carbon dioxide concentration that's plotted on this particular graph. What you see interestingly is that these follow more or less the same pattern with a slight lag, right? There is a lag, but then the troughs and the crests are more or less matching. But however, what you see here is there is a sudden increase. In fact, now it's more than 400 parts per million right now, 420 or so, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Can somebody tell me how did we create this 800,000 years of data? Any thoughts? Carbon dating, yes, but from where?
Fossil.
Not really fossil, but as you can see, your answer is right here. So, which is the Antarctic ice cores. So, what scientists have done is they've extracted the ice cores. Air bubbles trapped in the ice cores are analyzed for their gas concentration. And that's how they were able to say, depending on the depths at which they caught these cores, they could date it back, and they said, okay, this was the concentration of the gas at that particular time, which is how we were able to create this 800,000 is a very large time scale that we are talking about, right? So that's what is there. But then what happened is that after a time period, there's a sudden shock. It just increased exponentially, and which is what is the cause of concern. So what I'm going to do now is take you through a time machine. Let's see when this increase actually happened in the temperatures or CO2. But then let's look at it, and then we will talk about the reasons behind it. So the net is connected here. Okay. Can we get the other screen into focus? NASA has done is that using data and some simulations, they have kind of created an animation where they've looked at sea level rise over a period of time. They've looked at how carbon dioxide concentration has changed over many years and decades. They've also looked at how temperature has changed over many decades. So which will tell you, and some of them are observational data, especially temperature, which obviously says that, okay, people could have gone wrong when they simulated. That doesn't apply. It is actual data that's been measured with respect to some of those. So that way, yes, it kind of works. Oh, same problem. I think induced, right? So which is why, they said we need to do something about it. You need to go to the presentation. Cool. So let's look at the global temperature. Oh, so sorry. So what you see is 1884 to 2021. Keep watching the change in colors. It moves from blue to red. So which is the temperature difference as compared to the past certain period. And wherever you see orange and red, we are talking about anywhere between 2 to 4 degree change plus, right? That's what it is going to be, and you will see that it is starkly after the 1960, as rightly pointed out by you. More of the yellows creeping in after 1960. Europe, as you can see, you will see much more happening up there. Even the southern hemisphere, India, Africa, everything, you're kind of seeing that creeping in. This definitely shows we are definitely in a much, much warmer world than what it was in the historical past. Go back to the presentation. Yeah. So that, we need to do something about it, and there are multiple reasons. One is the development, yes, so which means fossil fuel use, the kind of transportation, and a whole lot of other factors that went into this particular increase. Now, what was very, very important at that point in time when they actually started discussing is that this line, for millennia, the carbon dioxide concentration went never above this line for 800,000 years. Right? 1950, 60, and beyond that, it just shot up and it's never come back. So the problem here is the rate at which the increase has happened. People argued for a very many years that it's a natural cycle. Why are we even talking about climate change as an issue? We don't need to do anything about it. Nature will take care of itself. Well, it could have if it had followed the same cyclic pattern. But the problem is the rate at which it happened was unprecedented. So which means there was no way it was coming back, and we're seeing it for us today, even now, that it's on an upward trend and it's definitely not showing any lowering. COVID time, yes, slight lowering happened. I'm sure some of you may have thought of it, that I can see that thought crossing some of your minds. But the point is, it was a very temporary. Even during recession, when it happened, there was a slight dip. But then, we all know with recession, with COVID, economy had come to a standstill. Every country wants to build. The build back is at a much faster rate. So we are at a much, much faster rate of increase is what we are seeing as we move along. Now this is about a highly, a global average that we talked about. So let's kind of look at this particular graphic where we are looking at temperature change between 1850 to 2020. Look at the warming. You see that 80 and beyond, just look at, this is our own time periods, right? Our lifetimes that we are looking at. We're definitely in a much warmer world. This is global average. Now when we come down to Asia, this is what it looks like, right? And then if you come down, still down, yeah, which is India, this is the warming pattern. So it's a more or less the same pattern, but then it kind of shifts depending on which part of the world we are in. Now let's come down to Karnataka. This is what it looks like, right? The temperature was much, we had a lot of lesser than the previous for many, many years. But then the closer we move to the decade that we are in, it's definitely been a much warmer decade, multiple decades that we are seeing, right? So that's the cause of concern here. So according to one of the global reports, it's like a Bible for people who work in the climate field, which is called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC reports as we call it. A very recent report which was published in 2021 very clearly says that climate change is affecting every inhabited region of the world across the globe, with human influence contributing to many observed changes in both weather. Please note the word weather. I'll tell you why I'm using that word here. And what we call as climate extremes, right? So just look at, these are the regions, which part of the world these are in, basically. This is South Asia. That's where India is going to be, right? So if you kind of look at it, it is a consistent increase, whichever part of the world you're looking at, right? If you look at changes in, precipitation, that was temperature. If you look at the rainfall patterns, in Southern Asia, here is again an increase. There are some parts of the world which have looked at a decrease, but let's concentrate on Asia and the part that we belong to. It is an increase, right? I mean, take for instance Karnataka itself. You are from different parts of Karnataka. In the past 5 years, right? Do you think there's been a change in the rainfall pattern?
Yes.
If so, how? What is the change that you're looking at?
Season
Season change. When you say season change, what do you mean?
This is winter season now.
Yes.
The rain is coming.
Okay, so the variability is there. Okay, what else?
I am from Bidar.
Yes.
For many years, it was considered to be a place where there used to be droughts.
Right.
Now we are having flooding.
Flooding, right? So there is change in the form of the event, right? Extreme event. It was drought, it is flood. It doesn't mean that there is no drought. There is drought, there is also flood. So there is compounding climate risks happening. It is no single risk. So saying that, okay, I am prepared for this is not enough anymore. You need to be prepared for multiple risks. That is what the messaging is all about. Now, when you look at the changes, agriculture and ecological drought, as they call it, right? There again, if you look at South Asia, it's the type of change. There is no great agreement. That's primarily because there aren't enough studies in the region. That's what it is. It doesn't mean it's not affecting this particular region, but that's what it is meaning. So ultimately what all of these very clearly say is that there's been a change. Now if we want to look at India specifically, yes, there is this Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, IITM, in Pune, which did an assessment, and they actually analyzed 100 years of data within India, actual monitored data. And what they've reported is that the average temperature in India over this particular period has increased by about 0.7 degree. Right? 0.7 degree doesn't seem like a big change. But please remember, it's an average. Which means to say, it could be much higher in some parts of India, it could be much lower in other parts of India. That's one thing. And secondly, 0.7 degree to you and me may not be a big difference. But if there are people who work on microflora and microfauna, fungi, lichens, these differences make a lot of change. It impacts them. And we're also talking about a lot of microorganisms which are extremely important for a lot of things that need to happen. See, the wood has to decay. Otherwise, there is no humification. If there is no humification, then the soil fertility, the soil carbon is going to be depleted. That's one thing, right? And all the other factors also are extremely important. It's an interconnected system, the web of life as they call it. So impact on one would definitely impact the other. So which is why it's a cause of concern. And what the study also talks about is that the summer monsoon precipitation, which is your June, July, August, September, the key primary monsoon season, they report that during this particular period, there was a decline by about 6% up till 2015, that period, okay? And they also said that the extent of drought during that time period had increased. So this is all the past. Now, what are they talking about in the future? So there are models, climate models, which basically mimic the climate system. So thousands of equations that go in to look at, what are the interaction, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, everything gets integrated and they create an earth kind of a system for a modeling space. And what they say is that in the future, there is going to be an increase in temperature by an average of 4 degrees centigrade or more compared to the recent past, which is 1976 to 2005. Now, 4 degrees centigrade increase is huge even for you and me. Even for people who live in Bidar, Bangalore, who are used to 45 degrees, if it hits 49, it's a sure death. Right? Now, why do you think people in Europe died because of a heat wave? Temperature was what, 33, 34? I mean, towards its normal temperature for you and me from the tropics. But the problem is their biological systems are not used to that kind of temperature. It needs time to acclimatize. Now, the problem with these kind of heat peaking is it's extremely sudden. It's a shock to the human system, right? Which is why the body kind of resists. And mostly who died? Elderly people. So they have comorbidities. That's the thing. And also it coincided with the, the vacation period when most of Europe is, on a holiday. They have the best of healthcare systems, but they didn't have, doctors. Right? So that's a different issue. But the point that I'm trying to make is that, what is normal for you and me may not be normal for somebody else. For for different kinds of population. COVID was a classic case, right? One thing they kept stressing is children and elderly people are going to be much more infected. And we saw it ourselves. A lot of us have lost people in our own families, near and dear or distant families, friends. I think there's not a single family which didn't actually see this, right? So that's the kind of thing. And what this also modeling says is that there are going to be more frequent heat waves which will persist for longer periods. If Bagalkote had a heat wave which lasted for 3 days in the past, now it might be 6 days. Now that's again bad news. It could be highly adversely impactful. And what it also says is increases in the mean annual and seasonal rainfall. So we're looking at more rainfall in the system, which is what we are experiencing, right? Bangalore never saw that kind of rain and flooding. In the past few years, we've been seeing it time and again. Northern Karnataka has had floods. Northern Karnataka has had hailstones, unheard of, right? So it's because of changes in temperature, changes in the rainfall pattern. Now it might seem like good news when we say, more rainfall seems like a good news, especially for a drier region. But the problem is, the infrastructure is not ready for taking that amount of rainfall. So which is why, having this information and integrating it into the planning. Like for example, we are a policy think tank, right? C-STEP is a policy think tank, the organization that I work with. So what we try to do is influence policy making to integrate this information in implementing new programs, right? It could be as simple as a check dam. Narega is something that all of us have heard of, right? So it's a poverty alleviation program, and check dam construction is one of the key things that happen. In fact, 60% of Narega budget goes into land and water related activities. So check dam construction, let's assume there is a design, there is a dimension that is there, which the what they call as barefoot engineers who are part of this system, they are given some instruction that it has to be this dimension, right? Because for every labor approval, there is a thing, in the government it has to be approved. So there is a fixed dimension that they have to construct, and they'll go by it and they'll construct it. What do? It's not that they do not consider the rainfall information. They do consider, but what they consider is the historical information. Now, we saw for ourselves that the historical information is definitely much lower than what is projected in the future. So, which is why integrating this information becomes important. One, because your check dam will not be washed away because of heavy rainfall. You're actually ensuring your investment also, right? Otherwise, you time and again constructing the same thing all over again. So, which is what we are not the only people who do it. There are a lot of groups who try to advocate that kind of information, right? So, I'll pause for here. So, this was the basics. Any questions, any thoughts on what we spoke up till now? We'll just take 2 minutes. We are already behind schedule. Yes, you had something to say?
Ma'am, when you said you're a C-STEP policy think tank, does government take your, what do you call it, your
Suggestions?
Yeah, suggestions and advices and
Yeah, we work very closely with the state. In fact, very recently we developed what is called as a state action plan on climate change for the state of Kerala, which was launched by the Chief Minister last week. Similarly, we also worked with the state government in developing an action plan for Karnataka. So, see, it's a plan still. Does it get implemented? Only time will tell, right? So, we all know that, there is a lag. But, we do not stop saying that, okay, anyway, it's not going to make a difference. We need to keep making more noise about it, which is what policy think tanks like us strive to do it at least.
But at least one example of one idea or implemented by
Okay, so in climate change, there is something called mitigation, which is cutting down emissions basically, right?
Right.
Do you see a lot of electric buses on Bangalore roads now?
Nowadays, yes.
The piece of work that led to that was done by us. We had done a lot of research, and we had suggested that they need to move and shift into implementing, these kinds of buses. So that's one example I can think of. All right? Yes. Did someone have a question, observation, anything? Okay, if not, let's get into the next part of the talk. So coming to the impacts of climate change, we all know there are multiple. We talked about drought, we talked about flooding, we talked about hailstones. which leads to drinking water supply problems, which also leads to vector-borne diseases. Because more water in the system, you have more of mosquito breeding. Then there is, malaria, dengue, chikungunya, you name it. Now, why do you think that happens? More moisture, yes, but then it also leads to, more of these vectors actually being in the system. That's because, the window of breeding. See, they have a fixed window for breeding. Now it expands. When it's an expanded window for breeding, obviously there is more population, then more exposure, and then more of these diseases that you see because of that. So these are multiple impacts that we've experienced ourselves. We've seen it ourselves in the system. So now, when you specifically talk about water, when we talk about climate change, see, we already have water-related issues. If you remember a couple of years back when South Africa, Cape Town went zero, right? 0 day for water. They said the next could be Chennai and Bangalore, right? We did hear about it. And what is happening is it's because of mismanagement, over extraction, so on and so forth. But that apart, what climate change does is it amplifies the risk, right? So it amplifies it, so you will have more of drought, flood, water supply shortages, distributional issues, poor water quality. Because the minute you have more water in the system, you have mud coming in, the quality gets impacted. We are talking not just about drinking water, even irrigation water. Now, one of the other larger impacts of climate change is sea level rise. There could be as high as 6-meter rise in sea level, is what many studies across the world say. Now think of a 6-meter rise and think about all the big economies that rest on the coast. Be it Mumbai, be it New York, all the largest economies are always on the coast, right? And it's not just about economy, we're talking about infrastructure on the coast, we're talking about people, we're talking about livelihoods. There are fisher folk. India has a long coastline, right? So given that, there are multiple impacts. The other issue is that when there is increase in sea level, there is salt water intrusion into the aquifers, groundwater aquifers. So which makes irrigation water saline. Your crop is going to be impacted again. Your drinking water, if you're relying on groundwater, that could become saline. So that is again a larger impact. So there are, these are interconnected. Otherwise, generally, okay, sea level rise, I don't live in the coast. Fine, it's okay. I mean, generally, I'm not blaming anybody. Even for me, if I didn't work in this space, probably I will not be able to connect the dots. Now, it's not just the farmer. If he doesn't produce enough food, people like you and me who buy food will have to pay more. As a country, we'll have to import more. So there are economic ramifications of this particular problem. One is lives, the other is livelihoods, the third is economy. Now all of these three is something that you and I day to day have to weave through. So that's why it's important to look at it from that particular perspective. Now looking at agriculture, the reason we say it would be impacting agriculture is one are the direct impacts which we saw because of flood, because of drought, because of hailstones. That's a direct impact. But there are indirect impacts of climate change, which is because of this particular study that, this is just one clipping that I've put. There are multiple studies which have very clearly said that climate change will disrupt flower pollination. Now without pollination, there is no food production, right? Now this is again for multiple reasons, because of changes in the habitat. When forests are cut, you don't have bee populations, there are no pollinators. I used to live in Sirsi for 3 years, between 2009 and 12, right? And as you know, Areca, and there was a large boom of vanilla production in that particular region, right? And there were farmers were struggling because the pods were not being produced. I see somebody now. Are you from that region?
I'm from Tirthahalli, Shimoga district,
So
but we had
you had a lot of problems. There was no pollination, so farmers were actually manually they used to go and pollinate. That's the thing. So it's a huge thing. Now if bee population collapses, I think we will collapse because there's going to be zero food production across the world. That's why we need to be worried about this problem. The other is, okay, even if it is not that large scale impact, okay, who doesn't like chocolate in this room? Hardly anyone, maybe one or two, right? So the flavor of chocolates could change because of the cocoa production, the quality of it changed. Be it banana, coffee, tea, beer, everything, the flavors could change drastically because of climate change, because you don't have rainfall at a certain time, you don't have enough soil moisture, you don't have certain temperatures which support, right? Apple production was impacted in the Himachal, right? So these are cases because of climate change that happened. So all of it is going to happen. It's already kind of happening in some way or the other. Now, moving on, before we get into what happens to agriculture in Karnataka, at C-STEP we've done this modeling that I described to you. We've looked at historical data. We've also looked at future, what is likely to happen, and then tried to see how it is likely to impact agriculture in Karnataka. Right? So the reason why we did this, and what we also did is, we looked at all the districts where agriculture, it's practically every district of Karnataka, and we focused on only rain-fed crops, 4 rain-fed crops. The reason being, if you have irrigation, whether rainfall occurs at a certain time or not, you are able to provide that irrigation. It doesn't impact the farmer so much. But then when you are dependent on rainfall, male nambid bhumi indre, then it's obviously very bad news for the farmer. So that's exactly why we looked at it. And the reason we looked at a 30-year period is, now I'll come to the question. If you remember, I asked you to kind of pay attention to the word weather, right? Climate. And in some places I'm using climate. Now, does anyone understand the difference between weather and climate?
Yes.
Can you explain to all of us here, what is weather, what is climate?
A small change over a period of few days or few months, that is considered as weather.
Right.
Over a period of what you said, 10 years, 30 years, that is
Yes.
called as what? Climate.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This is the first time I've had somebody from the audience give me this answer.
This was already been discussed.
No, it's great. Thank you. I'm so happy about it. No, I'm so happy because the problem is we generally, even in news, we use this word very interchangeably. Are climate change agoytu. Sari illa havamana badlavane anta elladukku havamana badlavane anta heltini. But the problem is, it is not havamana badlavane unless it is a consistent trend that lasts for a minimum of 30 years. That's the minimum. It has to be an increasing trend or a decreasing trend. Consistent or male hogtidre, then I say, okay, it is climate change. That's why they say it's global warming, because there's enough evidence to show that it's been skyrocketing totally, right? So that's the reason. So we picked up that minimum 30-year period and we took the near past. This was to make this conversation with government stakeholders and line departments. Now, if it coincides with my lifetime, I'm able to relate to it. So then it becomes easy for them to agree that, yes, it is a problem. I can see it happening. ನೀವು ಪಾಸ್ಟ್ 100 years 100 ವರ್ಷದ ಏನೋ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೋದು ಬಿಡ್ರಮ್ಮ ನೀವೇನೇನೋ ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೆ, ಯು ಡೋಂಟ್ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಟು ಟೆಲ್ ಅಸ್, ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಡೆವಲಪ್ಮೆಂಟ್. ದೇ ಆಲ್ವೇಸ್ ಟ್ರೈ ಟು ಪುಟ್ ಅ ಡಿಫರೆಂಟ್ ರೀಸನ್ ಟು ಇಟ್ ಟು ಅವಾಯ್ಡ್ ಟೇಕಿಂಗ್ ಆಕ್ಷನ್. I don't blame them because they're worried about day-to-day developmental needs, right? But climate will actually slow down development. It can derail it by 30 years if you don't do anything about it. 30 to 50 years of all the development that that has happened, that we've done, it can go back to that place if we do not pay attention to climate change, right? So which is why we picked up this 30-year period, and what we saw is that even within Karnataka, both summer maximum temperature, winter minimum temperature irbodu, these have actually undergone change, and what we see is that winter minimum temperature has increased much more than the summer maximum temperature. Right? Anywhere between 0.1 to 0.6 degree is what we see. Likewise, rainfall has also increased in Karnataka. If you look at all the districts of Karnataka, about 15% increase in most of the central and northern districts. In the Paschima Ghatta, that is the Western Ghats districts, what you see is a 20 to 25% increase in rainfall in this 30 year. Variability bagge, we look at how does it change right? That's something we look at. The next thing we do is we get into the future, next 30 years, 2021 to 2050, that's again, it coincides with our lifetime. So if I want to make any change, today I have to start planning. So that's what we try to do, and this is what for summer maximum temperature, right? That's your March, April, May temperatures that we see. What we see is that, and what you see here as moderate emission and high emission is nothing but these are scenarios. For example, we do know that there are a lot of policies. India did commit to something called as net zero by 2070, right? At the previous conference of parties, climate conference. And there is a lot of policies, lot of action, more renewables, Karana. We will kind of, make sure that the environment is safeguarded. Let's reduce emissions. Now the electric buses introduction is also a way of decreasing the emissions, improving air quality also. They are all interconnected again. So that's what is there. So moderate emission is if all the good policies work, right? Then probably, we will not increase our emissions as much as if we do not do anything, which is your high emission scenario, right? So that's what, so two scenarios, one with the policy, one without any policy. Business as usual continues. We will happily develop and we will die together. That is the kind of scenario, right? So this is the high emission scenario. And as you see, the increase is quite staggering. Next 30 years could be 0.5 to 2.5 degree increase in temperature, which is quite large in itself. And obviously the districts which already have higher temperatures will have much more warming. It's also to do with the geography of the place, right? You have hillocks, you have the soil type, the kind of, structures around it, that's all going to determine. Now, this increase, of course, could be plus or minus again. It's not one single number. It's an average for 30 years. So obviously some years could be much warmer, some years could be much colder. But what we need to keep in mind is, this applies to what you convey to your students also as trainers, right? See, modeling, it's based on assumptions. So people kind of argue that, this is not fixed. The aage agatte anta ನೀವು guarantee ಕೊಡ್ತೀರಾ for me to make a change ಅಂತ ಕೇಳ್ತಾರೆ. The argument here is the direction of change is not going to change. It could be 2.5, it could be 1.5, but still it's going to be different from today. So we need to do something to make that change. So the wisest thing to do is, if you prepare for the worst case scenario, then you're good for everything else, isn't it? So I think the message is, it does look like a, very gloomy situation, but there are ways to do it. There is a lot that's happening today. We need to be, and as individuals also, we can do something. That's the messaging that you could kind of convey. So similarly, when you look at winter minimum temperature, again, you see warming, right? It's much larger. Again, in the northern districts, it's going to be much higher. I'm sure each of your eyes are going to the district that you belong. Nan district alli enagatte alva, but nam district alli enagatte alla pakka district alli enagatte antlu worry ಮಾಡ್ಕೋಬೇಕು. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಕೆಲವು ಸತಿ ನಾವು ತಿನ್ನೋ ಊಟ ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಬರ್ತಿರುತ್ತೆ, right? The produce, in fact, one of the staggering things is that what they call is the food miles, right? Transportation of items across districts, across states is quite staggering. Tomato ಎಲ್ಲೋ ಬೆಳೀತಾರೆ, ಇನ್ನೆಲ್ಲಿಗೋ ಬರುತ್ತೆ. Actually it is produced locally also, but it goes to a market which is very far. Again it comes back. So it's a very tricky situation, but that is the fact, right? So anyway, so there is a whole lot of impacts that is happening that you see. When you look at Kharif season, which is your June, July, August rainfall, ನಮ್ಮ primary Rabinu ನೋಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ, which is your October, November, December, because there's quite a bit of agriculture production that happens during that season also. What you see is obviously quite a large increase, 5 to 25% increase in rainfall, more in the Western Ghats districts that you will see. And in the high emission scenario, even in the northern districts, you will see that kind of an increase. ನೀವು ಹೇಳಿದ್ರಲ್ಲ, ಈಗ ತುಂಬಾ ಮಳೆ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ, ಫ್ಲಡ್ಡಿಂಗ್ ಇದೆ. Earlier it was drought, now it's more of flooding. In the future, it means there could be more flooding. So probably the cropping patterns will have to change, right? Or the way or the variety of crop may have to change. So there are a whole lot of adjustments that the systems will have to make out there. And what is more important is, one is quantum of rainfall ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. But like the global studies and Indian studies say, extreme events will increase. When I say extreme events, more of heavy rainfall events, dry spells. ಒಂದು ಮಳೆ ಬರುತ್ತೆ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಒಂದು 2-3 ವಾರ ಮಳೆನೇ ಇರಲ್ಲ. Right? In agriculture, that's very bad news. Right? That's the problem. The distribution is extremely important when you're looking at a system like agriculture. And that would be very, very skewed. And what we see with respect to heavy rainfall events is, what we've done is, how many days in the next 30 years will have greater than 51 to 100 mm rainfall in a single day. We've kind of done that analysis, and what you see is that it is increasing in many districts. When you look at greater than 100 mm rainfall in one day, which is extremely bad news in certain districts, you will see that there is a large increase. 100 mm rainfall in one day is a sure flooding. And when it happens, it could be very bad news. And what's interesting is that in some of the drier districts, Bidar and Nodi, it is going to be a large increase. So which means, people have to kind of prepare. Right?
How was this analysis done?
This is using climate models. So using a model, we project what is the rainfall, and what we do is we compare it with the historical daily data and the change previous 30 years versus future 30 years.
So these are all simulated?
This is simulated. Future is all simulated. Yes. So which is why I always say, it's a plus or minus, but it will increase.
Yes.
It will increase. That's the messaging that comes in here. Right, so that's about what happens in Karnataka, what is going to be, potentially happening. Any quick thoughts? If not, we will move to the next, because it's been quite interactive as it is. Yes.
Basically, I'm a seed scientist.
Yes.
Breeding and seed production.
Right.
So what you told is there is a no pollination because of decrease in the population of pollinators.
Right.
That is the one thing. The
Yeah.
second important thing is flowers are there. Blooming is there, both male and female are fertile, but because of temperature fluctuations,
Absolutely.
stigma receptivity duration is decreasing, pollen viability duration is decreasing. Even though they are highly self-pollinated crops,
Right.
there is no pollination at all. We are receiving lot of complaints from the farmers.
Yes.
That is, yes, we have done all agronomic practices.
Correct.
There is no fruit setting in tomato. There is no fruit setting in pumpkin. Those varieties which have performed excellent from past 15 years.
Correct.
From past 15 years, they are growing same pumpkin variety, same hybrid. They were harvesting very good yield. But recently, from past 2 years,
Right.
they are facing major problem of fruit setting.
Absolutely.
So that is mainly because of sudden changes in the night temperature.
Correct.
That is a major thing what we are observing, and we are receiving huge complaints.
Absolutely.
So part of it, we visit a diagnostic clinic, so we receive complaints from farmers. That is mainly because of sudden change in the temperatures, particularly very low temperature during flowering, very high rainfall during harvesting.
Yes.
So that is what the major effect we are seeing recently.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you.
Ma'am.
Any other thoughts? Yes, please.
Because of this changing temperature, rainfall and all, the pathogens are mutating very fast.
Yes.
The microorganisms. Okay. And because of that, the disease pattern is also changing, and we don't know how to control it.
Correct.
For that, we are trying newer and newer pesticides.
Yes.
Again, different combinations. So a lot of pesticides is going into agriculture. It is all connected again.
Absolutely. Yes, I completely
So,
agree.
biomagnification.
Yes.
Again, it comes back to the nature. We don't know how to.
True, that is true. So it's a vicious cycle at the end of the day. You're trying to solve one problem, you're creating another problem.
So
Right?
minor pests are becoming major
Pests. Absolutely.
Minor
No, very
diseases are
rightly said.
becoming major diseases.
Correct. So, it's a very, interconnected system. So, which is why, at C-STEP, we kind of even, agriculture is a very, very sensitive system. Even when we are talking about, let's say, net zero, it's basically, it's how much you emit, you will sink in, or you will not emit, whatever that is. But the problem is if you look at a sector by sector ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ there are other problems. For instance, renewable energy ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ there is a policy, right? We will increase. So for increasing renewable energy, we're talking about wind, solar, right? You need land, right? You need land. Now, you need land for agriculture also. And we are also talking, one of the other policies is to increase forest cover. That also requires land, right? And to increase forest, it also requires water. Now this is, if you don't look at these in an interconnected manner, you will end up doing something, but you'll be creating other problems. So that's why, we have a model that we've developed ourselves where we look at these feedback loops, interconnections. So if, for instance, transport sector only, the way to reduce emissions, everybody says, okay, switch to electric vehicles, non-motorized vehicle, more cycling paths create madi, then, have people cycling, other thing, or live close to where, you work, etc. But the other way is, buildings also consume a lot of cement, is a highly heat intensive process. So that emits a lot of emissions, right? So emissions from the cement sector, ಅದನ್ನು reduce ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ building ಅಲ್ಲಿ consumption ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆಗಬೇಕು. On the one hand, I'm saying I want to reduce the travel time, so which means build vertically. So obviously you are kind of expanding vertically, then with more heat, you also need more cooling, right? So AC, ಮತ್ತೆ fossil fuel ಬರ್ತದೆ. So it's a very complex system. So there is no one linear way to look at a problem. That is the thing. So I think what we need to inculcate in every student is to try looking at the big picture. Don't restrict yourself to looking at just one problem. Okay, idರಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಏನಾದ್ರು ಮಾಡಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋದ್ರೆ, what does it mean for this? What does it mean for that? ನೀವು ಕ್ಲಿಯರ್ ಆಗಿ ಹೇಳಿ, ಪೆಸ್ಟಿಸೈಡ್ಸ್ ಹಾಕ್ತಿದೀವಿ ಅಂದ್ರಿ, ಸಾಯಿಲ್ ಫರ್ಟಿಲಿಟಿ is getting impacted. Next cycle of food production gets impacted. Water gets polluted.
And also monoculture.
And also monocultures. Yes, exactly.
ಅದೇ ರೀತಿ ಈಗ ನಾವು ಒಂದು ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಗಿ ಓಝೋನ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಓಝೋನ್, ಯಾಕೆಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಇನ್ನೂ ಇಲ್ಲೇ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ.
Ozone, actually the good news is, no, the good news is ozone hole has been plugged. We've done a lot of good things and it is sorted right now. That problem is sorted, thankfully. Yes.
Ma'am, regarding renewable energy resources,
Yes.
countries like India, for example, without deforestation, we
Yes.
can go with like some areas are there. Some areas are there, like desert area. We have Thar desert. We have like more than 1 lakh square kilometer area is there.
Okay.
One more we have Ladakh type
Yeah.
of area. So like with the help of this technology, we can also go with this like this type of technique, and we can build some renewable energy resources stations over there without harming the nature. And like
See,
why
you-
countries are not doing.
Absolutely. The point is, you can produce, but then transportation, energy. There are, in fact, if you ask me, the T&D losses, transmission distribution losses and energy, when you transmit power, it's quite huge.
And also maintenance problem is there.
Maintenance problem
It's
is
not
there.
possible.
Exactly. And also see, the desert is a desert for a reason. It has its own importance. I have had people arguing that why can't we create, why will not, we will convert grasslands into forests. Arey, grassland illa andre ninige ninna lion alla nee nodakagalla antina. Grasslands are needed. Those habitats are as important.
Has its own importance.
Every habitat is important. It could be the desert, it could be the snow covered area, right? So these agroecological zones anta heltivalla, that each has its own importance, own role to play, right? So that way, it becomes extremely important to kind of see that you maintain something, but at the same time you try to kind of do. It's a fine balance. That balancing act that he taught you, it is very true. It's a very fine balance that you need to do. So trying to solve something, you shouldn't be creating another problem. That is the most important thing. Right, so coming to the last part of the thing. So agriculture Karnataka, I already spoke about why we are looking at it. So I'm going to skip this slide. So coming to what she said. Each crop has something called a crop phenophase, which means, during certain periods of its growth, it requires soil moisture, it requires a certain temperature. They're very sensitive to that. If that doesn't happen, the problem that she described is what will happen, right? So this basically tells you, as an example, when sowing happens, our time and energy. So why we did this is, we took this crop calendar, right? And we looked at what is the temperature, what is the rainfall during these weeks. And then what we see is that the reds are all where it is different from what the crop requires. The greens are all where it is higher than what it requires. It's never a match. So which means to say it's bad news either way. So which is because of, these increase in rainfall, 2 to 6 times higher rainfall in some districts. Some interestingly, like if you look at Chitradurga, Davangere, Yadgir, historically, a 30 varsha analysis, not one event of greater than 100 mm rainfall. But in the future, you're likely to have at least 3-4 events happening. So which will have an impact on the yield, on the kind of things that she talked about, right? So that's what is important. So obviously the implications of this could be in an yield loss anywhere between 20 to 50%. A whole lot of studies report this. And it could potentially lead to quality of produce also getting adversely impacted. So that's what our work was all about. So finally coming to how we address this, one is, like I said, you reduce the flow of greenhouse gases by changing over, switching to cleaner technologies, switching to cleaner ways of doing things. The other is increasing the storage of carbon. That is through natural, you have to grow a tree. That's the natural means, it's your photosynthesis. That is the way to do it. Adaptation is now the interesting thing about climate change is that, let's say, all the countries in the world, all the well-meaning policies, everything kicks in, everybody is going to do only good things for the climate, from a climate perspective. Does that mean we've solved the problem of climate change? To some extent, yes, we're not increasing it, but there's something called committed climate change. Because the gases that get released have a lifetime. It's not instantaneous, the warming and the changes. It has a cycle. So there is some level of change that is bound to happen, even if everything is going to be in the best meaning way. So which is why we need what is called as adaptation. It's basically managing the unavoidable, right? So that's what adaptation is all about. So these are the two ways of doing it. For crop systems, we can do multiple things. I don't think I want to go into the technical details of it. But basically, you can do multiple things to do this, either technical interventions or institutional interventions where you improve access of information to the farmer so he's prepared better to kind of, address the problem, or crop insurance and whole lot of other things that they talk about. Or you can think of innovative ways of avoiding this. How do you, insurance, and they have to put a claim and then they get the money. There is other ways of doing it. Without a claim, can they get it? So you have a trigger. Idikina jasti adre, even without the farmer filling in that form, he should be able to get the money. Can we do that? So these are, suggestions that we give to the government. Now finally, before we end, if there are any questions for just 1 minute, I can pause, or over lunch also you can discuss. That's fine? Okay, so I'm going to close now. So as we know, as we discussed, climate change impacts us all, right? Because it's impacting the water system, it's impacting the food production, it's impacting the various small pleasures of life that we get by eating, having a coffee, a good cup of coffee or chocolate or a beer or whatever that is. It impacts human health. Heat wave impacts, mental health also can be impacted because of high heat. Road rage ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಕೇಳಿದಿರಾ, extremely hot. I mean, we don't actually attribute it. There are people who are studying the behavior. When there is extreme heat, our trigger points are much higher. We kind of lose our temper much faster. So that's something, and mental health also. When I say mental health, it's an indirect impact. If, for example, because of flooding, people loses his home, his family. It's a mental trauma at the end of the day, right? So that's why it is important to understand that. And of course, water-related diseases, diarrhea, dysentery, everything increases when you have more water. Pests and diseases increase, and of course, forest and biodiversity also gets impacted. Forest fires of Australia that we've been reading about is definitely because of high temperature, no moisture, everything, right? So that's what is happening now. So So finally, what I want to leave you with is that there is a need to act now. There are multiple options of doing this. You and me can definitely make a difference, even in our own small ways, right? So, because the footprint, the carbon footprint that each of us leave, the food we eat to the clothes, our choices, what we buy, how much we buy, how much we consume, can make a difference. So, I think there are ways to do it. It's not a very gloomy gray world. People are trying to do and bring that difference, and if each one of us try to make that difference, I'm sure the world would be a better place. You and I may not live to see it, but at least our next generation would be able to see it. Thank you very much. And here are some resources you might want to look into to, very young students or your family, some of the YouTube. I'm leaving this presentation here. You could refer to it and you could use any of the material that's out there. Thank you.
So, thank you so much, ma'am. There was just so many things that we could touch upon in this session. Do we have any questions before we break for this?
Ma'am,
Yes.
quick query.
No, I have time. You people have to go and see the rainwater harvesting thing.
Ma'am, the alternatives what we are thinking to replace the fossil fuels or the vehicle based on fossil fuels, we are thinking about battery operated vehicles.
Yes.
So that again it is creating burden on the nature, I feel. The production of the batteries and the recharging of the batteries, again we are burdening the nature.
So the way it is thought about is, battery, it's still an emerging technology. There's a lot that needs to be done. There's also this connect with critical minerals which India doesn't have, and your reliance on other countries increases. That's another problem. And there's only so much of minerals. That's it. The other question is, scrappage policy. See, you can retire all the vehicles, and what do you do with the existing stock of vehicles, right? So policies have to think ahead and think of, how do you do. And with respect to, how do you use this charging? Is it again going to be on fossil fuel or is it going to be on renewables? Now the problem with renewables is it is also climate sensitive. Yes, you can't have it here, so which means you need a battery to store it. So I think that's exactly why we need to have a long-term vision. Okay, if we produce this, the circular economy as they call it, what happens? Okay, I produce, I use, what next? I think that what next is the crucial question that each of us should be asking in whichever fields we are in.
And one more thing is, when we think of all these things and when we make the policies, do you think it is all human centric? Do we think only from the angle what is our need? Should we meet these needs or the younger generations to come up? How is it the whole picture of nature as it is?
In fact, you touched upon the most sensitive question in the entire climate negotiations. There's something called, equal but differentiated responsibilities in the climate, negotiations, right? So the differentiated responsibilities is about, who did the damage and why do we pay for it. So the argument is, development, we are still a developing country. India still has a huge population with developmental aspirations. We need food security, we need water, we need energy security. There's a lot that needs to be achieved. Now, in this climate negotiation, we are burdened with this thing that you also need to act on climate. Now, that's where the challenge arises. How do you balance the two? So, that model that I talked about is basically trying to look at how do we meet the developmental aspirations and at the same time make it low carbon. Now, India also submitted what is called as the low carbon, low emission development pathway for India in the recently concluded what they call as a conference of parties, COP27. All of us would have read and seen in the newspaper a lot about it, which happened in November. Now that basically talks about how do you do it. We will develop, but at the same time, we will make sure that our development takes into fold the low carbon pathways. That's the way to do it. It is a huge challenge. It's definitely not easy, which is what policymakers, scientists like us are all struggling with. That's a big question, but important to look at.
I think the definition of development should change. The development should bring us close to the nature, not away from it.
It's also about, how do you define development? Do we want to mimic the Western world or do we have to have our own standards of development? Rightly said. Thank you.
Most importantly, government should have policy makers, environmentalists in their cabinets.
We vote for them, so let's see how we do that.
Madam, you are working for policy making. Hence,
Yes.
I have a little bit. That means in the any project sanctioning or releasing of any chemical pesticides or anything, but that company must have the life cycle analysis, and also that may adopt the circular economy.
Absolutely.
Then we can only reduce the emission of the pollution.
Rightly said. See, that way there is no dearth of well-meaning policies in India. We have enough and more than when it comes to implementation, there is a gap. So which is why, we need to sensitize more and more people in all spheres, in departments, IAS officers, everywhere. We need to sensitize them, which I think organizations like CEE, even we try to do that. But it's a long way, long haul as they say. But I think we can't just sit back and say, okay, let's wait and see what happens. So we'll have to do what we have to do. And I think as teachers, you have a very important role, because at least can we sensitize the next generation to demand that? Can we sensitize the next generation to do what they have to do in whatever small way they are doing? I think that's where each of our roles are very, very important.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So in the interest of time, we will not be able to take more questions. I request your kind cooperation. You can always write to us. Sorry, there is, because the bus has arrived. Okay, this is a logistical problem. I request your kind cooperation. The bus will not be able to stay longer, and we yet to have a lunch. But we are very much in gratitude for putting up such a wonderful thing. And as a facilitator and as somebody who sometimes conduct teacher training, I'm very much impressed by ma'am's way of presenting. It's very structured, and there's always it's designed in a segment way, and there's time for discussion in between. She's pausing in between. And I think when we all go back to training our faculties as master faculties, I'm sure you're all senior faculties, you have your own expertise and you have your own pedagogy, which is very much evolved at this stage. I'm not being bold enough to make a suggestion, but I'm just taking a moment to spell out as a reminder that elements of these which will get crystal in our minds as a learner or as a participant, and we very much thank you for that, ma'am. Okay, so very quick announcements. The lunch is ready.